right? It's game day. So let's start. And I want to start by reminding you that it's fine. We live in the North. We're in Brockton, Massachusetts. But remember, it's more than just the Civil War. You know, the other term is the War of Northern Aggression. This is for our viewers as well. You know, the War of Northern Aggression or the war between the states. So we ought to be comfortable with all three. And lest I forget, there's a movie that none of you have never seen, I'm sure, that deals with the Civil War. And I'm not talking about Glory, and I'm not talking about Gettysburg. There's a very subtle, nuanced movie. It's called Pharaoh's Army. And I really anybody hear of it? Pharaoh's Army. It's subtle, it's nuanced, it's conversation, and it is the war writ small. There is a northern detachment of soldiers that spend some time, it's either in Missouri or Kentucky. You know, one of the soldiers has been injured, and they're in Confederate territory. And this woman her husband is a Confederate soldier, they are in her home until this soldier, one of their guys, recovers from his wounds. It is nuanced, it is carefully done, it's all dialogue, and you have to listen. It isn't Star Wars. You know, it isn't an animated feature film. It's dialogue and the tension, north and south. It's either in Kentucky or in Missouri. And remember, we mentioned both of those states were slave states, weren't they? Neither of which had left the Union. Half of Kentucky fought for the Union. Half of Missouri fought for the Union. Half of Missouri fought for the Confederacy. Half of Kentucky fought for the Confederacy. Pharaoh's Army. And Pharaoh is a substitute for Lincoln. Lincoln, sending the army in. This Pharaoh. So it's an excellent movie. Now, if you watch it, again, I don't mean to be, I'm being the teacher. Pay attention, listen to the dialogue, and let it carry you into how difficult it was, how the tension and how divided people were in their loyalties, and also as men and women, even though you're fighting for the rebels or you're fighting for the Yankees. So there you go. Everybody in this room has that assignment, and all of Brockton has that assignment as well, and wherever else this goes. So there you go. There you have it. So the last time we talked, you know, which was last month, we brought the story up to 1864. That the Lincoln has not yet been reelected. We're going to do that this afternoon, but we brought the story up to March of 1864, and General Grant. You know, General Grant has been brought by Lincoln to Washington to take command of the entire war, just as McClellan had initially. And McClellan by now has been fired. He's coming back. He's coming back to run against Lincoln in November of 1864. So Grant is brought to Washington and given command of the Western Theater, you know, west of the Appalachians, and the Eastern Theater, and that is east of the Appalachian Mountains. And we wound up by making the point last month that Grant said, I want to be in the field. I do not want to be a desk general. I do not want to get caught up in the politics and the social life of D.C. I want to be in the field. I want to be in the saddle. And Lincoln was prepared for that. Just keep in touch. And as he said to Grant, when you are in the saddle, you are the Union. Just keep me apprised of what's going on. And he could do so with the telegraph now. And the one thing that commanded Lincoln to Grant is that Grant out in the West, Grant had taken Vicksburg, and we mentioned that last time we talked, and we here in the East always focused down on Gettysburg. Vicksburg was as important, in that very same week of July 1863, Vicksburg was as important, maybe more important, than repulsing Lee at Gettysburg. Vicksburg opened up the entire Mississippi River. And that allowed Union troops, Union ships, Union cannon to penetrate deep into the South, parts of the South that had not yet seen or felt the hand of war. For Grant, Lincoln, I can't spare the man he fights. Unlike McClellan, who kept asking for more horses, more soldiers, more wagons, more artillery, Grant fights with what he has, and he gives me victories. Forts Henry, Forts Donelson, and now the prize, Vicksburg, and I'm bringing him east. And Grant, Grant's philosophy of war was not terribly sophisticated. By that I mean he knew that he had overwhelming resources across the board. And we referred to that the last time we chatted as Lee's arithmetic of the thing. And it's simply not just manpower, it's everything. And Grant, and this is so chilling, Grant, victory will come to the side that does not count its dead. How about that? Victory will come to the side that does not count its dead. And as Grant looked at the overall map that he put together in his mind, and then he put together on paper and then in the field, that we need a full court press against the Confederacy. What's been going on is that one army will attack here, and that army might get pushed back or whatever. Another army would attack over here. What we need is a full court press to attack the Confederacy on around the perimeter, and to attack them simultaneously. And he set up a campaign of there would be 5 attacks simultaneously, 5 offenses, 5 armies on the march, beginning when the road's dry and the weather clears, and 5 armies, one coming up through the Mississippi area into Alabama. General Nathaniel Banks of Massachusetts, General Benjamin Butler, also of Massachusetts, coming up, following the route that McClellan followed, coming up from the southern end of the peninsula, the Virginia Peninsula, that General Sheridan. These are the destroyer generals, Sheridan, Grant, and Sherman. General Sheridan, up the Shenandoah Valley, which had not yet been torched. Had not seen too much action. And the order from Grant to Phil Sheridan: leave the people in the Shenandoah Valley with nothing but their eyes to cry with. Burn everything. Make war so terrible. General Sheridan: make the Shenandoah Valley so barren that a crow, a bird flying over it, would have to carry its food. He used the word provender. Banks, Butler, Sheridan, Sherman, my old warhorse, Sherman, light out from the southeastern part of Tennessee, and bring the war to the heartland of the Confederacy. Your objective, General, is Atlanta. As I say down there, Atlanta. Your objective is Atlanta. It has not felt the stiff hand of war. Burn it if need be. Destroy it. It is a railroad junction, and it's fueling, feeding, providing materials to those armies, those Confederate armies still fighting. So take Atlanta, and when you take Atlanta, march to the sea, and march to the sea, get to Savannah, and when you get to Savannah, hang a left, and into South Carolina. That's where it started, and bring it on in South Carolina. We never hear about the destruction in South Carolina. We hear about the burning of Atlanta, don't we? But South Carolina, they started it. Bring it home to South Carolina. Myself, I know my job, and my job is going after Lee. And that part of the campaign was the overland campaign, constant contact with Lee. You see, historians today, military historians, talk about a shift from a soft war, fought by McClellan and others, to a hard war, a war of attrition. And basically the 3 generals in this war of attrition are Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. Make war so hard, so difficult, so painful, destroy their morale, to burn their homes, slaughter their cattle, poison their wells, make it so hard that they will give it up, the civilians and the soldiers. And the sooner they give it up, it'll stop the killing. Victory comes from the side that does not count its dead. End it with viciousness. And that's Grant and his overland campaign, constant contact. And I'm not going, and formally there might be a battle with Lee or a battle, and McClellan or whomever, it doesn't matter, would pull back, rearm, regroup, reprovision, refresh the number of troops he had, and then hit again. We're not going to do that any longer. Constant pressure. Go, 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 go. And Grant, I'm going to work Lee's body. I'm going to break his ribs. I'm not going to stop. It'll be constant campaigning. And whether it's the Wilderness or Spotsylvania, Petersburg, it's go, go, go. And I'm not going to give Lee a chance to regroup. And if we keep all these Confederates Army busy, for example, Banks, General Banks, you bring that war into Alabama, and therefore Confederate troops cannot be redeployed by rail, rickety as it is, to reinforce Lee or to reinforce anybody. Keep all these armies busy, keep them bleeding, and we will bleed them down. And that is, as we've said before, one of the parts of Lee's, the arithmetic of the thing. We don't like to think about it in those terms, do we? And now that black soldiers, have been enlisted in the Army from the Confederacy, came the word, if you capture black men in a blue uniform, execute them, hang them, beat them, execute them, or resell them into slavery. We are not accepting them as prisoners. They are to be murdered. And that's another story that needs to be, told someday in and of itself. I mean, this is a war so brutal, make it hard. And that's why, to come back to Pharaoh's army, it's so understated. It is so nuanced, so thoughtful. And pay attention to the dialogue, because a conversation sometimes is just conversational. It isn't me yelling. It's just conversational between the captain, the lieutenant, and the woman whose husband is off fighting for the Confederacy. In 1864, Lincoln is up for re-election, and the South was just hanging on. Lee, hanging on. If Lincoln can be defeated, if the war weariness in the North is so great, as it is among the Confederate families as well, if Lincoln can be defeated by a Democrat, and that Democrat nominated by the Democratic Party, George B. McClellan, and McClellan had been fired, as you recall, at the close of the Battle of Antietam in September, October of 1862. And now McClellan, out of the Army, a civilian, the nominee of the Democratic Party. The only issue is war. That's the only issue, to pursue it or to end it. And McClellan campaigned on a peace platform. When elected, not if, when elected, there will be a ceasefire. There will be a stand down. And there'll be a negotiated settlement, where I will offer the Confederacy terms whereby they can rejoin the Union with slavery. McClellan, I am not going to preside over the dissolution of the Union. Readmitted, these are the terms, with slavery to stop the killing. Lincoln and the South was so hopeful that if Lincoln is defeated and McClellan is elected, we can begin those negotiations. And if we parlay those negotiations in a very crafty way and string it out and string it out and string it out, and they really go nowhere, maybe by indifference or a failure to be more aggressive about negotiating, we can slip away. That we can slip away and become the Confederate States of America. Maybe, just maybe, so much is going to hinge on November 1864 for both sides. Because Lincoln's election or re-election means what? It means more war, doesn't it? That's what it means. Lincoln's not going to give it up now. Not after 3 years of war. I'm going to see this through. And they knew that. They knew that. In 1864, there were many in the Republican Party who did not want Lincoln to be renominated. They were looking for other candidates. They believed that Lincoln would be too soft on the Confederacy when the war ended, that we can't trust him. And what fueled that, and I'm going to come back to something that we just covered, albeit briefly, and that was when Lincoln began to think in November and December about terms for the defeated Confederacy, or defeated states, state by state by state. And he came up with what we call the 10% plan. And when 10% of the voters, let's say of Alabama, agree to write a new constitution, and they accept defeat, state by state by state, and we restore them to the Union, state by state by state, with only 10% of the voters. And there will be no firing squads, no hangings. There'll be some political punishment. In other words, a certain class of individuals, officers of a certain rank, or Confederate office holders will have to temporarily be unable to participate in politics, but they can appeal to me for a pardon. And everyone knew that Lincoln would be so generous with those pardons, because he'd pardoned so many young Union lads who were designated to be shot in the morning because they deserted or they fell asleep at their post. Lincoln, there's been enough blood. And the 10% plan. And you do not have to, and in that 10% plan, Lincoln did not insist that you have to denounce secession. In other words, you need to say that what we did was wrong, that I never supported the Confederacy, and denounce it. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to pledge future loyalty. 10% of the voters. And with regard to black voting, I'll leave it up to you. I'm not going to demand voting rights for blacks in Alabama. It's up to the states. That laid the groundwork. Congress countered that in July of 1864, and they countered that with a measure called the Wade-Davis Bill. And it was clear from the demands of the Wade-Davis Bill that those radical Republicans, those Republicans who challenged Lincoln, were not in any mood to be generous with their concept of peace or to end the war quickly. In other words, 50% of the voters of Alabama, not 10, 50%. You're going to have trouble getting 10. 50% must write a new state constitution. They must say that what you did was wrong, unlawful, secession was wrong, and that a very broad class of politicians and officers will have to appeal to the Congress for a pardon, not the president. And that Wade-Davis bill was to prolong the war and to make certain that Congress had a heavy hand, an important hand in Reconstruction. And Lincoln was not going to pick a fight in the summer of 1864. The Republican convention, is about to gather. So what Lincoln did with the Wade-Davis bill, in a very clever way, in an astute way, he simply did not respond to it. It's called the pocket veto. And that's a nickname for the fact that if I do not have 10 days to consider the bill, if it lands on my desk with only 6 days for me to consider it, not 10, Congress is going into recess, that I'll simply put it over there. And over there is my inside coat pocket. It's called a pocket veto. I'm not going to pick a fight. We're running out of time. And you may reintroduce the bill in the next session. I'm not picking a fight. He knew this was going to be a fight. He knew. And he knew the question, that would bedevil the relationship between him and the Congress. He's assuming he would be elected. Well, I shouldn't say that if elected, he wouldn't be assassinated. That we will deal with it after the war. And what's that? Did these 11 Confederate states really leave the Union? Did they really leave the Union? And he said, I don't think so. In fact, they did not. In my view, they did not leave the Union because they could not, and they did not. What happened here is that there were a group of disaffected individuals in Tennessee or Alabama or wherever who pulled the vast majority of good, loyal people from Alabama or South Carolina out of the Union. They were misled, they were misrepresented, and they were leveled with what this would mean. So no, they never left the Union. Just groups pulled people out of the Union. And Lincoln, and these are his words, to argue otherwise, that they left the Union, as he said, is a pernicious abstraction. Great phrase, isn't it? A deadly abstraction, a pernicious, evil abstraction. All it will do will confuse the political waters. They never left. When 10% say we want in, you're in. Just write me a state constitution that recognizes the end of slavery. You do not have to say you're sorry. Just say, I pledge future loyalty to you, to the Union. Come home. And he hoped that if Alabama did agree, it would snowball. Then maybe Mississippi or Louisiana, and slowly it would snowball. So Lincoln knew this. And Lincoln also knew that there were folks in the Republican Party that did not want him renominated. He's too soft. He won't punish, and we want punishment. And Lincoln also, in a move to show to display an olive branch to these Confederate states as well. The war is still on in '64. Grant is moving. These armies are moving. Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan are having the most success. Banks and Butler cannot get out of their way. So even though this is a full-court press with 5 armies, really 3 are doing the bulk of the killing and the dying. Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman. Lincoln wants to run with a Democrat in 1864, to run with a Democrat who, in his view, had the good judgment to continue to represent the seceded state of Tennessee in the Senate. And that man's name was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, a war Democrat. And a little bit of what happened here, and this caught Lincoln's attention. When the 11 states seceded from the Union, those 11 states were represented by 22 senators, weren't they? And 21 of the 22 resigned their seats, except Andrew Johnson. He was a war Democrat, did not believe in the efficacy, did not believe in the legality or the need for secession. He continued to represent Tennessee in the Senate. And he didn't get paid because we're out of the Union. We don't want representation. He was the only one who stayed in his seat to maintain the interests and the voice of Tennessee. Lincoln liked that. This is courage. This is a profile in courage. This is a man who is worthy, a war Democrat who supports the war from the Democratic side. And I want him as my vice president. And just like me, he's a self-made man. Bootstrapped himself up. His wife taught him how to read and write. He was a tailor, and he bootstrapped himself, mayor, governor, and now senator from Tennessee. I like that. And a former slaveholder, and a man who saw the light, not a full-throated abolitionist, but a man who knew that slavery was dead. It was a dying institution, and it will die, you see. And my signal to the slave states is I'm willing to put a Democrat on my ticket, one of you, a man who has better sense than you, and his voice will be in my ear to explain to me Southern thinking. It's upper South, it's Tennessee, but I'm showing you how open I am, one of you, and yet a man of such good judgment that he continued to represent the interests of Tennessee. My kind of guy. So Lincoln runs with Andrew Johnson, and McClellan expects to win. Lincoln expects to get beat. And he calls a meeting of the cabinet, and he passes a paper around the cabinet meeting, and he asks all of them to sign it. What are you signing? What am I signing? Just sign it. Historians called it the blind memorandum. Just sign it and I'll tell you what you just signed. You never want to do that. They trusted Lincoln and they signed it. And what it simply said, and you can read it, that I expect to get beat in November. And I expect also all of you will stay in your seats and you will help the incoming administration. So there is a smooth transition from the outgoing to the incoming administration. It will be McClellan. There'll be no bitterness. There'll be no hard feeling. A smooth transition. The ins replacing the outs. Now, I mean, that's rather commonplace today. You know, when one administration replaces another, well, at least for the most part. This is new. This is Lincoln. I expect to get beat. And I expect you gentlemen to do your job and to maintain this smooth transition. We've got enough problems. And it doesn't happen, does it? Lincoln is reelected by a huge electoral majority. And that platform, those planks in that platform spoke to or redefined and repurposed, if you will, the Republican Party. That this is a party of the future, that in that platform, that they propose a transcontinental railroad, the Homestead Act, you know, the farmers moving west, a good deal, you know, 160 acres of land for building 19 prices. We want to get west. We want to settle. Monies or a promise for internal improvements. Again, you know, railroading, harbors, and so forth. That a tariff, you know, to protect local industries. This is a program for the future. The government will sponsor A&M colleges, agricultural and mining colleges. MIT, I know it's not west of the Mississippi, was initially founded as an A&M college. And an amendment to abolish slavery. That, and we talked about this a little bit, that Lincoln abolished slavery by an executive order. And we talked about what, you know, as a war measure. I don't want to rehash all of that, as a war measure. But as an executive order, it can be overturned by another incoming president. I expect to get beat. But I want the country to know that we here, the Republicans, we are proposing an amendment to the Constitution because it's very difficult to get an amendment in, and it's even more difficult to get an amendment out. And again, to refresh your memory, how difficult is it to get an amendment in? 2/3 of the House must approve, 2/3 of the Senate must approve, and then it goes out to the states, where 3/4 of the states must approve. Tough to get it in, but I want it in because it is difficult to get an amendment out. You need to reverse the whole process. And that's where we stand in November of 1864. And Lincoln wins. He wins big. And for the Confederacy, it means more war. And for John Wilkes Booth, it means I need to eliminate Lincoln. Maybe that's the only way to win this war, to eliminate Lincoln, you know, and to remove him from the process, from the politics of the matter. I'll come right back to that. Sheridan continues to push and burn and pillage the Shenandoah Valley. And it's beautiful today. One rides through the Shenandoah Valley. It's beautiful, rolling countryside. He turned it into a smoking chimney, if you will. And Grant pushing on Lee. As I said, Spotsylvania, you know, the wilderness, Petersburg, the crater, and Lee trying to bob and weave with not enough men. See, Grant is beginning to encircle him and to get around him, to encircle him so that he cannot retreat through the upper South, through Carolina, and hook up with any remnants of the Confederate Army that are being chased by Sherman up the Carolina coastline, Joe Johnson in particular. And I don't want that to happen. And at Petersburg, you know, we have a foreshadowing of World War I. In other words, trenches, hand-to-hand combat, incessant fighting, long-range artillery. You know, a precursor, if you will, a foreshadowing of what happened in the Great War on the Western Front in 1914. And Lee bobbing and weaving, trying to get around, and Grant. And it's like running a quarterback out of bounds. You run out of playing field. And Lee runs out of playing field. He can't get away from Grant. Grant has too many men. There's no way out. And Lee sends a message to Grant. I want terms. I want to surrender. I want an armistice. And we're going to meet at the Appomattox Courthouse. And remember, it was Wilbur McLean, when he moved to Appomattox, after first Bull Run, telling his new bride, honey, we got to move out of here. That we're on an axis for war. That axis is Richmond to D.C., D.C. to Richmond. And as he said, after the war began on my front lawn, in my front yard, and it ended in my parlor. And it followed him right to the ceasefire at Appomattox. And, some argue, and they're wrong, it's a specious argument, Grant would never do this. That Grant deliberately showed up dirty, unwashed, in a muddy private's uniform to show disrespect for Lee. That's not true at all. Grant always wore a private's uniform. I don't want people shooting at me. I don't want my rank. Makes sense, doesn't it? I don't want to wear my rank. These Confederate sharpshooters are good sharpshooters. They can take an eye out of a squirrel at a mile away. They can put a musket ball in my head at a mile away. And the reason he showed up in that muddied private's uniform, in those muddied boots, is when he got that message from Lee, I'm on my way now. I'm not going to go, shower and shave and put on my dress uniform. I'm going now to end it. And Lee showed up, showered and shaved, immaculate, and presented his sword to Grant. And Grant said, there's no need for that. There's no need for that at all. And they talked a little bit, and must have been difficult to make small talk, don't you think? Grant asked Lee, do you remember me from the Mexican-American War? And Lee said, no, I really don't. No, I don't remember you. It must have been awkward, don't you think? I've just surrendered to you. At least you could give me something. I don't remember you. And as the aides worked out the details, that small talk had to have been so difficult. And Lee asks Grant, my men are hungry. My men are hungry. And Grant ordered, have your commissars go down to my supply wagons and grab 3 days of supplies. And Grant did know this, that the mules and the horses were owned by the soldiers, and he wanted them confiscated. And when Lee said, but these men, it's their horses, the officers, it's their mules. You can keep them. You'll need them for the spring planting. It's already late, April, for the spring planting. The men must surrender their weapons. The officers can keep their sidearms, but the muskets, if you will, the Springfield Enfield rifles must be stacked. And they were. Now, Lee's men, some of Lee's officers, were urging him to continue the war in a guerrilla-like fashion. Take the war into the hills and wear them down. Guerrilla war, if you will. And Lee, there's been enough. I'm surrendering here. It's done. It was Palm. Easter was coming. It was Palm Sunday weekend. Easter was coming. We'll all live to see another year. We'll all live to celebrate Easter. And the war is over. And the jubilation in Washington, ecstatic. Jeff Davis had already escaped. He had loaded up his wagons with paperwork from the administration and also gold, escaping. And he was making his way. Jeff Davis was with a cavalry escort. He was making his way to the Mississippi River to continue the resistance in Texas. He never made it. He sent his wife ahead. He told her, take the children and run. Go into the North Carolinas, find Joe Johnson. He'll shelter you. I'm going to continue the resistance. And She disobeyed him. How about that, huh? When she fled, with a cavalry escort, ostensibly into the Carolinas to find Joe Johnson, she took a big detour. And I want to be with you. And he's running. He's running. He's a Confederate government on the run. He's running. And the Union cavalry are right behind him. I mean, there may be 4 or 5 days. He doesn't know. He knows they're right behind me. And he stopped. A rainy night in Georgia. Sounds like a song, huh? A rainy night in Georgia. They stopped at night to rest the horses and to rest themselves and to boil up some hot coffee, black coffee. And they're sitting there in the rain, pouring. And we can only rest the horses for so long. They're behind us. I know they're coming. And suddenly, out of the night, came Mrs. Davis, Verena Davis. What are you doing here? I miss you. Yeah, you can't miss me. I'm a government on the run. And suddenly, out of the night, came the Union cavalry surrounding him. And he tried to get up and run and to pull his revolver out of his holster. And she threw her rain gear over him, like L.L. Bean or Orvis, the rain gear over him. And she just, women's belts buckle from the other side. The buttons are from the other side. And suddenly he's got this, he can't get out of it. And he tries to draw his pistol, and he can't draw it because the coat doesn't close properly. I can't get my pistol out. It saved his life. He would have been shot out of the saddle. And I'll end this piece simply by saying, when the Union press was told that they really drummed up the story, that he was dressed like a woman. When we captured him, he was in drag. He was fleeing in drag, dressed like a woman, and all the drawings and illustrations. He was furious. I'm the president of the Confederacy. I'm on the run with a Confederate government heading for Texas to continue the resistance. And the press is reporting I was dressed like a woman. Thank you, Verena. Thank you very much for that. She got him out of jail. She's the one who absolutely was relentless in appealing to Andrew Johnson. Now that Lincoln is dead, of course. We're going to take care of Lincoln in a minute. To free my husband. She was relentless. And she went to Grant for intercession. She went to the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton, to free my husband. Don't shoot him. Lincoln had no plans to shoot anybody. So he escapes the hangman's noose, if you will, with Appomattox, and ostensibly that ends the war. Now I know there was still resistance in other parts of the Confederacy, particularly in Texas. But in effect, for all intents and purposes, the war is over. And the crowds are surging through downtown Washington and crying and applauding and drinking and celebrating. The war is over, the war is over. And John Wilkes Booth and his team of assassins, who had been meeting from time to time in Mary Surratt's boarding house. You see, they had planned, Booth had resigned from performing, that he no longer performed at Ford's Theater. And he wanted to help the Confederacy somehow. He had promised his mother that he would never join the Confederate Army. Now, I guess when you promise your mother, you don't break your promise, I guess. But he didn't promise he wouldn't work behind the scenes to win the war, somehow, by some fashion. And he contemplated, and the first plan was to kidnap Lincoln. You think Lincoln was absolutely negligent about his safety. And it was public knowledge that on many weekends, Lincoln, to get out of Washington and to get away maybe from Mary and to get away from all these office seekers and to get away from the war, to go up to the old soldiers' home, which has just been reopened maybe 10 years ago. And the elevation was a little higher, so the heat and the humidity, there was a bit of relief from that. And he would by himself, maybe 3 or 4 soldiers, would go up Pennsylvania Avenue to spend a weekend at the old soldiers' home. People knew that. And Booth, let's ambush him. Let's grab him. and we'll kidnap him. And then we will ferry him across the Potomac and offer him back to the Union for two things. One, accept the independence. Two, return all of our POWs. And that was the plan. And they pulled in Dr. Samuel Mudd into that plan because somebody might get hurt, and we need a doctor there. Lincoln's no good to us dead, that's for sure. So that day when they were waiting in ambush all day in the woods, waiting for that carriage to come by, Lincoln, unexpectedly, a contingent of soldiers arrived with some captured Confederate flags, regimental flags. Damn, I have to greet them, I have to celebrate this, I have to thank them. So he didn't make the trip that weekend, that maybe Saturday morning or Friday afternoon. And then the war continued, and now it's Appomattox. And Booth gathering these men. We need to kill him. We need to kill Lincoln. Not only do we need to kill Lincoln, we need to decapitate the federal government. This was a bold plan. It was an impossible plan. And John Wilkes Booth was very captivating. He had a strong, magnetic personality, good-looking guy, full head of hair. He was catnip to women. I always like to use that when I can. And in the Surratt home, Mary Surratt had a crush on him. And her daughter Anna had a crush on him too. And they were kibitzing back and forth. And mother is too old for you. You're too young for him. He needs an experienced woman. You're only 24. I flipped you, I'm 42. All right, so there's that going on. And can you imagine, they're making sandwiches for Booth and his plotters, and they could hear what they're talking about. These were rough, loud men who came in with pistols hanging off their belts and knives and talking at the top of their voice and drinking while they're talking. You know, the more you drink, the louder you get, and the more repetitive you become. And these are thin walls. It's like staying at Motel 6. Now, if you're staying in room 1, you can hear what's going on in suite number 25. She knew, she was part of it in some ways. So Booth, we are going to decapitate the head of the federal government. We're going to kill Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Grant, Secretary of War Stanton, and Secretary of State Seward. If we can decapitate the government and cause all that kind of chaos, maybe then the Confederacy will be able to slip away, that we can help them pull victory from the very jaws of defeat. Lee has surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. And gentlemen, and he was so magnetic, so convincing. Oh. We will do a great deed here. They will write books about us. They will poems about us. There'll be statues, plays. I'll star in the play. We will be remembered. This will be, and he wouldn't use this term because this is a term for turn-of-the-century anarchists, the propaganda of the deed. In other words, rather than talking about it, we will do it. Who is with me? Gentlemen, are you with me? And Dr. Mudd gets up and he said, this is where I get off the train. You know, I was in for kidnapping. I'm not in for first-degree murder. You guys are delusional. He would have said it if he thought of it. I'm saying it for him. He's going to go to jail anyway. And that night, as they fan out across Washington, and the word was, obviously the word was in the paper, the Ford brothers had advertised that the Lincolns are going to be here. This is the closing night of a British comedy, you know, our American cousin. And the place will be packed, and it was. 1,000 seats filled, and the Lincolns are coming. The Lincolns are coming. Lincoln enjoyed the theater. He particularly enjoyed Hamlet. He enjoyed the way Booth played Hamlet, the way he played Shakespeare. And he went to the theater often. And Secretary of War Stanton chastised Lincoln for this, that you are so vulnerable. Aren't you concerned about your safety? No, anybody can get me. If I'm concerned about my safety, I cannot do the job. My job is to be public. My job is not to hide, it's to be visible. And we're going to the theater. In fact, I'm asking you and Mrs. Stanton if you'd like to accompany myself and my wife. I've got 2 extra tickets. I'm not going. I am not going. You know how I feel about this. No, you ought not be going either. And Lincoln shopped those tickets around. He offered Grant. And he called up Grant. Ding-a-ling-a-ling. Ding-a-ling-a-ling. General Grant, would you like to accompany myself and Mrs. Lincoln to the theater? And I can see Grant, can't you? Putting his hand over the, over the phone, over the mouthpiece. It's President Lincoln, Julia. The theater. No. No, I can't stand Mrs. Lincoln. She's loud. She always has to be right. I can't stand her. He called up Secretary of State Seward, the same pitch. Darling, it's the president. He would like to know if, no, I can't stand Mrs. Lincoln. She always has to be right. She's loud, brutish. No. And we know that she had issues, right? We talked about that. And he asked Robert, his son, who was recently returned from Appomattox, do you think you can score a date, and come with Mother and myself to the theater? And he said, I'm tired. I'm tired. I want to watch Monday Night Football or whatever. So I've got 4 tickets. Even Mary said she was tired. And he said, you're going. You're going. Our marriage has absolutely gone dusty, dry, and brittle. He was calling her mother by then. And whenever a guy calls his wife mother, it's done. It's over. Bank it. All right? It's history. It belongs with the Peloponnesian Wars. You're going. You're going. We have to begin to heal. So she reluctantly agrees, and he still has these 2 tickets. So he's wandering around the White House, and there are aides. I mean, there are guards, and he asks one of the guards, Major Henry Rathbone, would you like to go to the theater with us, with myself and Mrs. Lincoln? And Rathbone, can you see it? Me? Yes, you. And your lovely fiancée, Clara. We'll pick you up in the coach at 7:30, 8:30. And he went. But he was unable to protect the president. The only assassination that was carried out successfully was that of Lincoln. You see, the Grants weren't there. If Grant had been there, Grant always traveled with 4 or 5 aides, officers, armed, and it would have been guarding the steps leading into the presidential booth. But Grant wasn't there. And the only guard was a Metropolitan Police officer, who was kicked back on his chair, waiting for the intermission, because as soon as the intermission was about to come, he was going to run across the street and get a stool at the bar, he and the guy who was the carriage driver for Lincoln, because 1,000 people are going to make a run for the bar. And I want to get a place. I don't want to have to wait. So he left. I'm just watching the time for you. He left, just as the intermission was about to come. So when Booth stole in up the stairs, there's no one there. And he had a Derringer, and he had a butcher knife. He had a Bowie knife with him. And I'll be brief here. That as the play unfolded, and Lincoln is here, Mary is here, over here is Clara, and sitting to Clara's right is Major Rathbone. And Mrs. Lincoln, during the play, had hiked her chair over next to Lincoln's. And she put her weight against him and put her head on his shoulder and held his hand. Remember that song, Lady's Choice? When I put your head on my shoulder? All right, Lady's Choice, last dance, Lady's Choice. So Clara, the smoking lamp is lit. Mrs. Lincoln has kind of huddled up to her date, her guy, so she hikes her chair over next to Major Rathbone and takes his hand and puts her head on his shoulder. So there's weight there. And he's on the far end of the presidential booth, and it's dark. And suddenly there's a crease of light, a crack of light in the presidential booth. And Booth has opened the door. And Major Rathbone looks quickly, and he sees an arm coming out with a pistol. He can't get up because of the weight of Clara. I cannot get up. He gets up, but Booth has fired, and Booth slashes Rathbone. Now, he cuts him open like a pig. He cuts him from the throat to the abdomen. It's Rathbone's blood that was all over Mary's dress, and not Lincoln's. Lincoln's wound cauterized on its own. And he died, it was Good Friday, and he died that Saturday. And we know, don't we, that the apotheosis had begun. That is to say that Lincoln was no longer making history. You know, it was being made for him. You know, and on President's Day we always celebrate. Whenever we talk about the President's Day, I always like to mention the fact that presidential historians always rank the three top presidents: Lincoln, Washington, and FDR. Then everybody else is in fourth, fifth, or whatever place they are. And as I said, he's no longer making history. It's being made for him. And the nation mourned. The nation mourned. And Walt Whitman caught that mourning, didn't he? And we all memorized this poem at one time, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." You know, when at one point there was elocution class and people had to memorize a poem or memorize a Shakespearean soliloquy or maybe tell a joke, I don't know. Get in front of your peers, make eye contact, the voice, the pace, the diction. And, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." And that funeral train made a very long, circuitous route from Washington back to Springfield, following the same route that the Lincolns had taken when they came from Springfield to Washington. And the man who organized all of it was Secretary of War Stanton, and choosing the same engineers and the same crew to take Lincoln home, and his body home, accompanied by his son Robert. Mary couldn't get out of bed. She was in bed for a month. Could not. It broke her. It broke her. And she was not crazy, never crazy. She had emotional issues, but she was never crazy. It broke her. And when Robert finally had her committed to an institution, and she was examined by physicians, they told Robert, "Your mother isn't crazy. She's broken. There's been too many deaths. 2 of her sons, her husband, shot down." I can only imagine the post-traumatic stress disorder that Mrs. Kennedy must have had, and all of that. And trying to pack, remember that you see, trying to pack his brains back into his head? I mean, and she was broken. 3 of her brothers died fighting for the Confederacy. Her biological father had died. She never got along with her stepmother at all because the stepmother took time away from my father, my time, and I was his favorite daughter, and she resented that. That happens, doesn't it? Another woman, "I'm your daughter," and mother is dead, and you remarried so quickly 5 months later, and boy, the people buzz about that. Whoo, 5 months later, she's still cooking in the ground, heating and, warm. And Mary, it just broke her. She wandered. And the physicians, "Your mother's not crazy. She's broken in so many places. She is devastated by what's happened." And so she just carried out as best she could. And meanwhile, Lincoln, the apotheosis has begun. Now, the trial is held, for the assassins that are captured. And that's a whole conversation for another time. But just to be brief about it, Mary Surratt is hanged. Johnson did not pardon her. As he said about Mary Surratt, she kept the nest that hatched the egg. Those are his phrases. Those are his words. She kept the nest that hatched the egg in her boarding house, you see. And she knew. She knew. And she's hanged. And only in America does this happen. That boarding house, which everyone wanted to burn to the foundation, and Ford's Theater as well, that boarding house still stands today. Only in America does this happen. It is a Chinese restaurant. Only in America do things like that happen. When Mary Surratt was hanged and the other 3 or 4 conspirators, when the hanging was over, and she was, none of them were commuted, Samuel Mudd was given life. Life in a prison in Florida. And when the hanging was over and the bodies removed for burial, the platform, the plank, was all cut up into small pieces, and the wood was sold as souvenirs. The gallows were sold as souvenirs. The wood was cut. The rope was cut into foot-long sections and sold as souvenirs. Only in America does that happen. And Mudd, life in dry tortugas, and he was finally pardoned by Johnson. And he was pardoned because he helped the warden work. Men were dying of dysentery, yellow fever, and he worked to care for those who were dying. And Johnson was petitioned, and he pardoned Mudd. And Johnson runs into a major battle with Congress over Reconstruction. Had they left the Union? Lincoln, they never left the Union. They never left the Union. To argue that way is an abstract, it's pernicious abstraction. And Johnson had a big problem with Congress, over Reconstruction. And that is an entire 3-week presentation by itself as well. Lincoln had given voice to his thoughts about Reconstruction now that the war was won, and he gave voice to his thoughts in that second inaugural. And we'll close with these words: with malice toward none, with charity for all, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who has borne the burden of battle. There's been enough death, enough hate, with malice toward none. So we'll close with that, and this is going to button up our 3-part series. I hope that we can meet again sometime in 2019 when the weather clears. And again, your homework, Pharaoh's Army. And really, if you don't like it, I'll buy it from you. No, I won't.